My name is Maria Moncayo, and this is my case study on oil exploitation impacts in the Amazon basin of Ecuador. The Amazon basin is the world's largest rainforest, covering 40% of South America. It's the drainage area for its second largest river, houses 10% of the world's biodiversity, and 15% of its fresh water. In this case study, I'm going to focus on the Amazon basin region located in Ecuador. As you can see in this map, it makes up a large part of the country. It is the largest region in Ecuador. The region contains one of the most diverse collections of plants and animals in the world, and it is home to 5 indigenous groups and has a population of 500,000 people, which is 5% of the country's population. Oil is very important in Ecuador's economy. In 1967, Texaco Gulf, which is now Chevron, discovered a rich field of oil beneath the rainforest, leading to an oil boom that has permanently reshaped the region. Before the discovery of oil in the Amazon basin, Ecuador was one of the poorest countries in Latin America. But since then, oil production has been the primary cause of Ecuador's economic growth. Today, oil is Ecuador's major source of income and accounts for 40% of export earnings. Chevron was the main oil company in Ecuador since the 1970s and was partnered with Ecuador, the government-owned company. And after more than 20 years of exploitation in the Amazon jungle, Chevron is no longer in Ecuador, but Ecuador has taken over and accounts for 55% of Ecuador's total oil output, with private companies accounting for the remaining 45%. Crude oil is a complex mixture of organic compounds, mostly hydrocarbons, which are organic compounds composed of carbon and hydrogen atoms. The fate of crude oil in the environment is difficult to predict because the composition of crude oils are different and so is the waste produced during the oil activities. Their makeup can vary widely, with hydrocarbons ranging from very volatile light material to more complex heavy compounds. There is limited data in air and soil contamination in the region. In this case study, I will focus on water contamination from oil activities, because most data available from the Amazon region of Ecuador focuses on the total petroleum hydrocarbons in the streams and rivers. The total petroleum hydrocarbons is a term used to describe a large family of several hundred chemical compounds that originally come from crude oil. Because there are so many different chemicals in crude oil, it is not practical to measure each one separately. Therefore, measuring the amount of total petroleum hydrocarbons at a site is more useful. Water analysis for TPH have shown high levels of TPH concentrations in rivers and streams used by the communities that are near oil fields in the area. In some streams, hydrocarbon concentrations exceeded more than 100 times the limit permitted by the European Community regulation. Since 1999, the oil companies have been required by law to regularly monitor the level of pollution in water, and they send those reports to the national government of Ecuador. But this information is not released to the public. Oil development activities include several processes that lead to water contamination in the region. First, during the drilling process, each exploratory well that is drilled produces an average of 4,000 cubic meters of drilling waste. If commercial quantities of oil are found, the production process begins, and during this process, each facility produces over 5 million gallons of liquid waste every single day. Then during the routine maintenance activities at over 300 producing wells, there is 5 million gallons of waste produced. All this toxic waste produced during the oil exploitation process are placed in waste pits, as the one in the picture here, which I will go over more detail later on how these waste pits lead to water contamination in the region. Oil spills are also a source of contamination. Just in the period of 1972 through 1993, more than 3 billion gallons of toxic waste and crude oil were discharged into the land and waterways of the Ecuadorian Amazon basin region. This far exceeds the 8 million gallons spilled in the Exxon Valdez tanker disaster in 1989 in Alaska, which was one of the largest sea oil spills that ever occurred. The toxic waste deposited in the waste are a major source of water contamination in the region due to the lack of laws and regulations in Ecuador for the disposal of the oil waste. In this short video, it explains how oil waste disposal practices from major companies such as Chevron differ from practices that the same companies use in the United States, and why this has been a major cause of contamination in the region. Today, Chevron is no longer present in Ecuador, but Ecuador, the government-owned company, has taken over, and there's still more than 200 open online pits in the region.
Begins when a well is drilled, and pits are created for the temporary storage of oil waste. The pits are lined with industrial tarp, which acts as a highly resistant membrane with puncture and tear resistance designed for heavy weight, liquid, and extreme temperatures. The tarp prevents oil waste toxins from seeping into the ground. While extracting crude oil, the drilling muds, toxic oil waste, and chemical lubricants are stored in the lined pits. In the separation station, crude oil is refined, and the remaining toxic water, what in the oil industry is known as produced water, is re-injected into the ground. When the drilling is complete, the oil sludge is disposed of and the pit is refilled, restoring the site to its natural state. This is the process Chevron and other oil companies generally followed when extracting oil in the United States. Much of the industry had used these drilling and waste disposal practices for years before Chevron entered Ecuador. In fact, in 1962, the American Petroleum Institute published a manual describing the proper re-injection of produced water into the ground. The manual stated, among other things, that extreme care must be exercised in the handling and disposal of produced water, and warning of possible seepage into nearby surface water sources or onto lands used for farming and grazing. Texaco itself had even patented a new technique for re-injection which addressed the problem of pollutants seeping into groundwater. Because Chevron knew that to not do so would cause considerable pollution problems. And in the United States, they followed these standards, but not in Ecuador. Here is what Chevron did in the Ecuadorian Amazon, one of the most fragile and biodiverse ecosystems in the world that is home to 5 indigenous groups. Chevron chose not to re-inject toxic produced water into the ground. Instead, the company installed pipes to drain the toxic wastewater into rivers and streams. And Chevron chose not to line its waste pits the way it had done in the United States, allowing toxins to seep into the soils and contaminate groundwater often relied on by local inhabitants for their drinking water. And rather than properly dispose of the toxic sludge in the unlined pits, Chevron chose to leave it there. The company installed pipes to transport the sludge and contaminated rainwater into nearby streams. Rather than capture the toxic natural gas during extraction, Chevron burned off the gases, a process known as flaring, producing huge flames and releasing dioxins into the environment. This blatant pollution and destruction took place right in the backyards of the indigenous people.
For many years, residents of the oil-producing areas of the Ecuadorian Amazon region have raised concerns over pollution related to oil exploitation. Many local streams and rivers, once rich in fish, now support little life or no aquatic life. Cattle are reported to be dying from drinking from contaminated streams and rivers. These are typically the same waters that people use for drinking, cooking, fishing, and bathing. Residents have also reported that bathing in the river causes skin rashes, especially after heavy rains, which accelerate the flow of waste from nearby waste pits into the streams. Oil exploitation in the Amazon basin of Ecuador is a major public health concern. It has caused irreparable damage to the environment, the health of the population, and is a major cause of the extermination of many native tribes and their cultures. Due to the concerns of the population in the region, several studies have been conducted on the health effects of the communities that are near the oil fields and who are exposed to acute or long-term contamination. In the studies, contaminated communities were defined as communities that were located downstream from an oil field and that had a high level of TPH in the water, as you can see in the diagram here. Communities that are defined as not contaminated were communities located 30 kilometers or more upstream from an oil field, and these communities were used as controls. Several studies found that communities in oil-producing areas had elevated morbidity rates, with a higher occurrence of abortion, dermatitis, skin mycosis, and malnutrition. There were also elevated levels of cancers of the stomach, rectum, skin melanoma, soft tissue, and kidney in man, and cancers of the cervix and lymph nodes in women. There was also an increase in cancers in children. The Amazon basin is the most diverse area of the planet. Oil blocks are usually concentrated in the most intact part of the Amazon, which is usually also the most diverse part. Therefore, oil drilling is a major threat to the biodiversity of the region. Since the start of oil exploitation in the region, there has been a drastic decrease of several species of plants and animals in the area. Oil affects the plants and animals in the region in several ways. Oil can destroy the insulating ability of fur-bearing mammals and the water repellency of birds' feathers, thus exposing these creatures to the harsh elements. Without the ability to repel water and insulate from cold water, birds and mammals cannot survive. Many birds and animals also ingest oil when they try to clean themselves, which can poison them. They can also eat other animals where the oil contaminants have concentrated. Another way that oil affects animals is when some of the oil eventually stops floating on the surface of the water and begins to sink into the marine environment. It can be damaging to the fragile underwater ecosystems, killing or contaminating many fish and smaller organisms that are essential links to the global food chain. When exposed to oil, fish may experience reduced growth, enlarged livers, changes in heart and respiration rates, and fin erosion. It has been reported that many local streams and rivers, once rich in fish, now support little or no aquatic life. Indigenous tribes from the Amazon have presented their complaints to various administrations of the national government of Ecuador, and have also filed a lawsuit that's still ongoing against Chevron, demanding that the companies clean up the environmental pollution, compensate them for the damages caused by oil-related contamination, and the stop of oil-related activities on their land. In response to those complaints, in 2003, the Ecuadorian government pledged to keep the oil underground in the Yasuni, which is a national park in the Amazon basin region and the most biological diverse spot on Earth, in exchange for $3.6 billion from the international community. This proposal by the government was named the Yasuni Initiative and was administered by the United Nations and said to be one of the world's most innovative conservation plans. But a few years later, the government withdrew the proposal, saying that the pledges received from countries were minimal and that Ecuador had been failed by the international community, and now drilling is authorized in the Yasuni National Park. Since then, the Ecuadorian government has not designated an adequate strategy to prevent further negative environmental and health impacts, or to remediate any of the oil-related contamination. Instead, in response to nearly $16 billion in external debt that Ecuador has, one of the main economic strategies of the national government and the International Monetary Fund has been to expand the oil exploitation in the country. There are several actions that should be taken to prevent further negative environmental and health impacts in the region. First, a remediation plan has to be developed and implemented. The different processes of oil and water, which are known as weathering processes, are important when talking about remediation, because the different processes that oil undergoes when released into the water can either hinder or facilitate the remediation process. For example, dispersion of the oil into the water leads to the removal of oil from the water surface and may facilitate processes such as biodegradation. On the other hand, the process of emulsion can cause the oil to become more persistent and reduce the other weathering processes. Biodegradation is also a process that can be taken advantage of during remediation, because it can aid in the removal of oil contaminants. For example, during the Exxon Valdez oil spill, fertilizer was added to enhance biodegradation. This bioremediation technique such as the one used in Exxon Valdez case, is a technique that should be considered for the remediation of the Amazon basin. Oil companies operating in the Ecuadorian Amazon should also change their practices to minimize the environmental impacts, and partnerships should be created with local communities so that they can benefit from the development. Environmental monitoring systems should also be established, and further data should be obtained in the contamination of the air, soil, and water from oil activities, and have this has an effect on the health of the population. The enforcement of laws protecting the environment and the health of the citizens is also necessary. The future of the region does not look good. The lack of laws and regulations for oil exploitation and the increase in oil activities due to the government selling oil exploitation rights to China and authorizing drilling of the Yasuni National Park make the situation in this region an important public health issue. It is argued that the oil industry has an important role to play in the development of the country, but that development should not come without a cost of pollution and poor health for the population.